Hello everybody and welcome back to another Sibylline Podcast. My name is Alexander Lord, the lead Europe-Eurasia analyst here at Sibylline, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Elizabeth Bullock, who went to Ukraine shortly after the beginning of the full-scale invasion back in 2022. It's fantastic to have you on, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining. So, Elizabeth, could you maybe just set the scene in terms of, why you went to Ukraine?
I will say first off, it was not the plan to be there for 3 years. I had a very normal background. I'm not ex-military. I'm not third sector. My entire career was actually in technology startups. I happened to be in between jobs. I'd just been traveling around the Middle East for 4 months and the invasion happened and it just felt important to do something. And it just progressed from there in the beginning around Kyiv and then ended up, we formed a team with some other Brits. And we spent the next 3 years working primarily in the Donbass and in the southern front, the Kherson, Mykolaiv area.
Fantastic. So you went to Ukraine pretty soon after the full-scale invasion, just a few days, right?
10 days after, yeah.
10 days after.
And it's only 2 days to reach Ukraine from the UK. The same time it maybe takes us to road trip from the southern England to Scotland. It's really not far.
Right. And so you drove across that border early 2022. Could you just talk us through some of the sort of experiences that you had when you first got there? Obviously a country in turmoil, reeling from an active invasion. Because at that stage, it was very much the received wisdom, which proved to be incorrect, that Russia was going to essentially conquer Ukraine, that the war was going to be a relatively quick affair, that the Russians retained all of the advantages over Ukraine. Obviously that didn't happen. But could you just talk us through a little bit of your thought process and, what it was like during that period where we really did not know where it was going? And if anything, the trajectory was that things are going to end probably sooner than later.
Absolutely. And for that reason, I actually didn't tell anybody apart from my nearest and dearest that I was going to go into Ukraine because I didn't know if I would be able to. I didn't know if the country would have fallen by the time I got there. So that first day in country, was even crossing from Poland into Ukraine, you could feel the air change. As soon as you crossed the border, there were just people everywhere. You could almost, at the risk of sounding slightly dramatic, you could smell the fear in the air. And these people were exhausted. They didn't know where they were going to go, hungry. I remember going to get fuel from the petrol station and they had to lock it because there were so many people outside that they were clearly afraid, not that they were going to get mobbed, but there were just too many people. I went to Lviv railway station. I'd taken over some sort of winter supplies, sleeping bags actually, and gave them to someone who I'd prearranged to meet there. And again, the railway station was, you think of the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, I don't know, of people who went through that train station while there was that mass exodus. It was so palpable how you could feel it. And I drove 2 women, each of them had a young daughter, out that day, who again I prearranged to meet. And it was heartbreaking because I met them. And there was a man with them as well. But we had one of the women spoke a bit of English, but it was a bit of a language barrier. I also hadn't done this before. So I was very much out of my depth of how do you interact with someone in such a difficult situation. I just didn't know really how to be. I learned with time. Anyway, but when we got to my car and loaded them in, I sort of realized that what was actually happening was that he was the husband and father of one of those families. And he had traveled across Ukraine with his family to make sure they reached me. And then he was going back alone. And they had to, I had to watch him kiss his little girl goodbye, not knowing if he was ever going to see her again.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because of course, there was the blanket ban on men leaving the country. So seeing all those families across the border must have been quite the sight. So you initially were working around Lviv.
No, we were based out of Lviv. We didn't do. I evacuated a couple of families, but that was just the first couple of weeks. Very quickly, we were just running many medical supplies into Kyiv. So we would go back to Lviv to get supplies. But no, we didn't really spend any time there. And even with our running in and out between Lviv and Kyiv, that was, again, maybe only 2 weeks. We were based out of the Donbass by early April, I think. Early to mid-April 2022.
Okay, interesting. So obviously all the world's eyes really were on Kyiv for that initial period of the war when the famous tank columns, everybody will, I'm sure, will remember tank columns streaming down from Belarus,
Yes,
being absolutely destroyed by Ukrainian fires. And
indeed, I drove out past them after that tank convoy had been destroyed, that famous convoy outside Kyiv. The first day the motorway was open, we happened to be leaving that Kyiv that day. So we drove down it, and that was a real sight. I have pieces at home of molten silver metal, because all the metal had melted and pooled in the bottom inside of the tanks. And there was a Ukrainian ambulance that had been shot through its windscreen that was just left there. It was all still there. It was, yeah. And I remember on the pedestrian footbridge over the E40, there were several, but there was one where you could still see Molotov cocktails lined up there, and you think, my God, how brave must those people have been to be in such a vulnerable position and be up there throwing Molotov cocktails on Russian tanks. You just can't help but have so much respect for what they were doing to defend their city.
It's incredible, and with so little preparation as well. And I was lucky enough to be in Kyiv last April, and driving to the north of the city. 4 years, that was about 3 years into the war then. All the fortifications hastily dug still there on the sides of the road, the pillboxes, some more updated fortifications, clearly, built after the initial Russian withdrawal, but the scars are still very much there. And driving through Bucha, Irpin, even a few years later, the scars are still there.
That's a funny one, because actually in that part of the country, the fortifications things have actually hugely died down from 22. Once it became clear that the Russians were not going to reach that far, the number of checkpoints massively scaled down. Some of the defense on the roads, they were kind of, I think, dismantled and maybe taken somewhere else. So that actually became a lot. I mean, when I very first drove to Lviv, they literally closed all the main roads and funneled you through this road with very high concrete walls on each side with huge defences. And it was a perfect sort of trap, to make sure they could control, because they had such a fear of infiltration. It's funny, when the last time I went back to Ukraine a few months ago, I went back to Bucha and Irpin for the first time since that time, that post-liberation. And it was quite surreal, because they have already built, which is good, they've already built memorials, huge flag with crests of the different military brigades who helped to defend it. QR codes so you can scan and learn the places where people were massacred. So it was very bizarre for me going back to Ukraine a few months ago, and from there going on to the east and the south, where I've spent more time and would spend the majority of my time of that trip, where it's still very much live and happening, but simultaneously going to part of the country where it's almost history already.
Right.
It was very surreal having the duality of that. The famous bridge of Irpin, where there were such famous photographs of the people walking across it. Again, we were there back in 22, and then you see it now, and it has all these memorials and signs, and checkpoint Giraffe near it, which I hadn't even heard of at the time, which was a very famous checkpoint who they helped to defend the Russians getting across into the city. It's
fascinating that, it's memorialization, even though the war is still very much ongoing.
Yeah.
And you do see that across the country, and it's fascinating. One of the takeaways I had when I went through Bucha and Irpin as well is actually the reconstruction that's happened. The scars are still there, but actually it's quite an affluent part of the city.
Absolutely.
And it, before the invasion, it was very affluent, beautiful big houses, very, very lovely. Then you see, the reconstruction that's happened, lovely new houses have been replaced. But I remember passing, perfectly rebuilt area, and then just a block of homes which is still completely blackened and scarred, burnt out. So
Absolutely.
It's this is a live situation still.
Yes, it is quite bizarre there. I found it quite bizarre. We sort of stayed in an Airbnb, and it was a sort of nice apartment, and then I remember being on the balcony and just noticing a small shrapnel or bullet hole just really on the wall of the balcony, and then the house that you could see down to had been burnt out quite a lot, but then other parts of it have been very well repaired. I remember in particular driving past this this brand new very small shopping complex, supermarket, maybe electronic shop, just not massive. And I had a video from when we drove past that building where everything was completely burnt out. There was a dead Russian soldier next to the road, and just the utter destruction around. On the whole road, you had to sort of weave in between all of the debris. So to suddenly realise, and checking on the map, oh yeah, no, this was definitely the same spot, that now you've got this sort of new little shopping place where we went in and bought some food. It was very surreal.
I can imagine having that sort of the comparisons of the two phases of the war. So Kyiv very much is, it's the capital. It is obviously facing a significant threat at the moment with long-range strikes, particularly in the depths of winter. But broadly speaking, the city sort of carries on as best as it can. Moving to the east and the south, which is where you spent the majority of your 3 years in Ukraine, I wondered if you could just sort of give us a little bit of a sense of the realities of war, really, that you had to deal with. Because, your experience in Ukraine is particularly valuable, I think, for people to understand, because, you're not just in Kyiv, you're not just in even Dnipro. You are right at the front lines.
Yes. I actually love Dnipro. When we're based in the Donbass, maybe once a month we go back to Dnipro as our sort of weekend break, and it actually reminded me of London quite a lot for having a river through it. Yes. And I quite like that. I really like Dnipro. Ukrainian people often talk about it as quite an ugly industrial city, but I didn't find it so. I'm really fond of it. But yes, so the Donbass and the South were very, very different theatres. The Donbass was a slow creeping progression of destruction, and you having to very, very slowly pull back. Now, I will caveat that with saying that unfortunately there are often now depictions in the press as though the Russians are just marching across the open steppe and, taking multiple villages every day. It's really not the case. It is very slow. But so in the beginning, we were evacuating people out of Lysychansk, which is in Luhansk Oblast. Severodonetsk is essentially a twin town. They're just either sides of a river. Severodonetsk had fallen and Lysychansk was soon to fall. And this was how we started working in the Donbass, because the Ukrainian friend said, will you help us get people out who are trapped? So bedridden, disabled, people without a car, families with small children, etc. And that became our MO for 2022 in the Donbass. But that was how it started. So Lysychansk, we were only there for a few weeks before it did fall. Most of our work was in and around Bakhmut, which was the major battle of 2022. And, you would learn and you check the maps. And as we talked about, I would read the Sibylline reports on our way in, and we'd be driving down these sort of potholed roads or these farm tracks, and I'd be reading the reports which you'd very kindly given everyone free access to during that time. And the other thing we would use would be social media. No longer the case now, and certainly not a company I would endorse now, but we use Twitter. And the reason being was that you could put hashtag Bakhmut or hashtag any other village you're going to around there, in Cyrillic, in either language, whatever, and it will bring up everything that's most recent. So if something gets hit, someone will, not always, but quite often they will post a photograph with the hashtag of the name. So that was the only way to know what happened within the last 24 hours, because no reports anywhere, no coverage anywhere, no deep state map, anything was updated that fast. So those were the sort of tactics that we would use. But things would just slowly get more destroyed, and you just slowly have to push back. So in Bakhmut, for example, it is quite a long, thin city and has a river running north to south through it. So having to make decisions of how long do we keep crossing that river? And of course, eventually one bridge got hit, and then another one was just too close to Russian line of sight, and just slowly putting back. I remember the strongest indication that it was close to the point where we couldn't be in that part of it anymore was if all the power lines were down. If the power lines were shot down and just lying on there because there'd been that much artillery, then that was a pretty good sign. But, back then we were operating up to 1 kilometer from the line of contact. We did, on a couple of occasions, hear small arms fire. We did not do that lightly, and that was because there was urban density. We did not have direct line of sight from, Russians having a battle in the fields over there. But we didn't have FPV drones back then, and that was the huge difference. After a while, we would get a little bit aware of the potential for reconnaissance drones. And therefore, if they spotted us, if they could feed that back to control and command, and then we would maybe be at risk from artillery. But there were no armed drones back then. So the way that we operated back then, no one could do that now. No one can be 1 kilometer. And again, also now, the whole concept of the line of contact does not really exist. Certainly not in the same way. You have this porous grey zone. I know out of country, some people use grey zone to refer to hybrid warfare. In country, not at all. It's hybrid warfare. Grey zone is this area that was contested territory. So we would follow what were the grey zones when we were going in. But now that grey zone is so large, with the range of FPV drones having gone up to 40 clicks, being sent out on mother drones and then being dispensed. So 2022 was a very different thing to what the war is now, and seeing that come through. And then in the beginning of 2023, we relocated to the south. Bakhmut had fallen, the front line had stabilized, not so many people needed evacuating. So in the south, it was very different because you had this huge swathe of liberated territory. So what that meant was utter destruction, houses burned down by phosphorus with the bones of people in the basement, just tiny pieces of bone, people who hadn't survived. People having been tortured, people having been interrogated. Every police station was turned into an interrogation centre. A huge amount of mines. That was a huge problem. So families who had been trapped under occupation, when the Russians would push back, they would try and get out if they wanted to leave. And tragically, awfully, some of their cars hit mines, and if they were tank mines, they died. So, but then also simultaneously, everywhere that was along the north bank of the Dnipro River, so Kherson city and then all of the villages along there, went almost overnight from being under occupation but relatively peacefully so. I caveat that with everything that the Russians were doing to the population, but they weren't having a huge kinetic warfare going on. It went from that to being frontline because the Russians merely pulled to the south bank of the Dnipro River and started shelling the north bank very heavily. Again, in the early days, it was just with artillery. But then while we were operating there, you started to have the growth of FPV drones. So you did have to be careful. It absolutely was a consideration. We had conversations within our team. How would we handle this? Mostly it was a case of just get in the vehicle and get out. Just move. Now, of course, as we know as well documented, that within Kherson city, you have what's called the human safari, primarily because Russian trainee drone pilots are sent to the South Bank and told us to train themselves by hunting Ukrainian civilians, which is just horrific. So I would not go into Kherson city now because I cannot justify doing so, and the risk would be so high. It would be an irresponsible thing to do. But that, again, when I was last there, I was in Kherson Oblast. We were within FPV range. So suddenly you are on the open steppe and you are watching the sky in places that even just a year ago, even though there were FPV drones, absolutely, those areas would not have been at risk.
Fascinating. And, just to sort of reflect a little bit on the changing nature of the war, because you very eloquently explained, just how different operating close to the front line was in 2022 versus now. And obviously over the last sort of 12, 18 months, we've seen a proliferation of FPV first-person view drones, as you mentioned, and it is completely changing the nature of the fight. And the grey zone that you discuss, as you mentioned, 40 kilometers, and it's extending even further. The Russians themselves are innovating at quite the pace. And of course, the Ukrainians, generally speaking, do retain many of the advantages in terms of drone innovation. But for example, fiber optic drones.
The Russians got the edge.
The Russians do have the edge, and that's...
Well, they don't anymore, but they did it first.
Yes.
And that's the thing with all of it. If one of them innovates, it's a short matter of time before the other probably gets it. But yes, the Russians having the edge with FPV drones was critical in them retaking Russian territory in Kursk.
Precisely, absolutely. And you do see the deployments of various elite Russian drone units, and we track this, trying to understand what's going to happen at different sectors of the front. Generally speaking, that's a clear indication that this is a priority for Moscow, that they're deploying their very best. And the elite drone units, they are the best of the Russian army at the moment. And they do, for all their mistakes throughout this war, the Russians are learning. And it's been interesting to watch from afar, of course, you much closer, the learning curve that both sides have had to deal with, and the way that they learn from one another as well. For example, the Ukrainians were the first really to deploy specialist drone units, and then later
it was actually the Ukrainian farmers who started it.
Right. Yeah.
They had FPV drones anyway to survey their property, and they started doing that and then feeding the information back to Ukrainian soldiers. So the entire use of drones, really, it started with Ukrainian farmers.
It's so fascinating that agricultural drones, which we're familiar with in the West as well, in Western Europe, that was at the cutting edge.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to see how rapidly that can change the nature of warfare.
Yeah.
Obviously, bread and butter artillery, armored vehicles still being used to a less extent, etc. But the war really is defined by drones in many ways. And this is what's allowed Ukraine to stay in the fight, I suppose, in that they have gained that advantage. But that advantage isn't to be taken for granted. The Russians are learning. They are a learning machine. They still make mistakes. But I suppose the concern is where that puts Ukraine in terms of the longer term strategic depth and production that the Russians sort of have the advantage on.
Absolutely. And I think one of the helpful contributing factors is that Ukraine has a culture of freer innovation, whereas within Russia, the culture of persecution for if you make a mistake, a head will roll, is much higher. And that has bled through not just with their innovation, but even with their entire warfighting tactics. People have to send orders up the chain of command and back down again, which is partly why they were so slow to adapt and respond, and particularly in the early days of the invasion where they met the resistance they weren't expecting. So Ukraine culturally will always retain that edge. But yes, absolutely, the Russians' ability to learn and change should not be underestimated. But Ukraine has been so open-minded, and among things which I found fascinating when I was there was that Ukraine just has a much more tech-savvy population than we do, and that sounds like such an obvious thing to say. But when you have a country where people are so used to digital systems, you have such a high prevalence of coders and developers, and it's just more embedded in society in a way that we just do not have anywhere in the West in that way. Of course, you get people who work in the technology industry, which I indeed myself used to do, but it is pocketed. And what that means is that so many of them can apply it. I remember speaking to someone the other day, and one of her friends who's a soldier had just programmed on his phone to have a effectively remote control trigger pull for his AK-47. So the AK-47 would be, call it, a couple of meters away from him, and he would tell it to fire so that he would not be as much of a target. I spent some time last time I was in country with a Shahid drone interceptor pilot. So they are, as the Shahid drones are flying into country, they will fly up their own interceptor drone to take out the Shahid drone from behind. And he himself had been a developer, and this is a guy sat in a field in a tent, either absolutely baking in the summer or freezing cold during the winter, and just, coding and developing, doing these things on his laptop just to make it work. I mean, as a society, Ukraine has an incredible resource on that front, which indeed I think in some ways Russia does too. Of course, we know they have many coders and developers. But I do wonder if it's quite as embedded across society as it is in Ukraine. I don't know, but I wonder really if it is.
Yeah, that's a fascinating dynamic to this war, that sort of grassroots, decentralized, mobilization really of these talents.
Yeah,
and
digital
of course,
army.
Digital army, right? And this war is being fought on multiple fronts, from the battlefield all the way through to cyber and even economically, etc. So absolutely, I think Ukraine does have so many advantages. There's a lot of work that we've been working on in terms of trying to understand Russian production rates, for example. And obviously Russia is a much larger economy. It has the strategic depth which Ukraine does not. However, it's not without its own challenges. And there are limits to what the Russians can mobilize. And indeed, a lot of that has been self-imposed. The Kremlin is not wanting to mobilize as many resources as comparatively Ukraine has had to. They have that luxury to be able to choose to an extent, although, of course, Ukraine is inflicting those costs now. Particularly over the last 6 months, we've seen a massive increase in the rate of Ukrainian long-range drone attacks against hydrocarbon, oil refining capability, etc., which is hitting the Kremlin's purse. But I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on, your sense of Russia's relative advantages in terms of production, particularly in the drone space, but also more broadly. What's your sort of thoughts on that?
It's a complex one, because on the one hand, as you say, Russia has that economy, but at the same time, as we all know well, Russia's economy is the same size as Spain. So it really should not be hard to economically, as a collective West or collective Europe, it should not be difficult to defeat them economically. But in terms of production, there were certainly reports in the autumn that Russia's rate of munitions production and their rate of conscription would mean they have enough resources to open a second front. And by that, I mean a non-Ukraine front, be it the Baltics or anywhere else. So we do all seem elsewhere in Europe to be quite secure in the idea that Russia is just tied up in Ukraine and Ukraine will hold the fort for the rest of us. It's a position that we should not necessarily take for granted. As well, of course, as the reality that if the rest of Europe and the West let Ukraine fall, we would then, of course, be dealing with that aggressor in our own hands. But at the same time, Russia does have other assets that have been cheap but horribly effective. So the entire use of glide bombs, these are very old, ancient bombs. This is not innovations of technology. All they've done is stick wings and navigation systems on them, and they are devastating. We used to, in the south, we used to just sit at night and watch the glide bombs hitting Kherson and how loud the booms were, because they carry large payloads. And in Kharkiv in particular, they've been devastating. So that is, this is old munitions. It doesn't matter really if they're faulty. They just got to stick some things on them and just send them in. And so, as with all of these things, Russia needs to be treated with caution. But if we as a collective West had more confidence to actually stand up to them more cohesively, economically, it should not be hard to defeat them.
Right. And I think there's quite a lot to unpick there, actually. And I think we'll circle back to the sort of strategic piece and how the West can and should sort of respond to the Russian threat. I mean, your point on glide bombs, I think, is a really, really important one. These are ancient systems, like you said. They're very easy to produce. The Russians have large stockpiles of them, but they have such a huge impact on the battlefield and in the near rear. And one thing we've been tracking is the increasing range of these systems. They're now being able to strike Zaporizhia, a major city as well. But cities that previously were relatively, long-range strikes aside, were relatively insulated, but now are sort of feeling that the kinetic, more the front line feeling of, drone and increasing glide bomb attacks. And I think that is one of the lessons to be drawn from the war in Ukraine, really, is that in the West, I think we obsess over the exquisite military capabilities, but actually sometimes the bread and butter, bog standard, even past its sell-by date systems, if employed with enough creativity, can achieve significant battlefield effects with a minimal cost. And I think that's what the Russians have done. We've seen the Russians rely on increasingly old kit, especially tanks and armoured vehicles, famously, deploying and refurbishing, Soviet systems that we've not seen for decades.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure you've seen images of Russian soldiers kitted out with World War II rifles.
Right.
I mean, it's...
Absolutely. And this is the thing. So, the Russians, by all accounts, they are not as technologically advanced as perhaps they would want the world to think, but they can still achieve battlefield results through relatively limited capabilities, just through the sheer number of men and the willingness to throw their lives away, essentially.
Yes. I mean, the low value that is placed on human life is grim. I have, spoken to people who have come across Russians who were literally sent out armed with sticks. I've spoken to people who've talked about Russians using their dead compatriots to literally build a wall to hide behind, like you would use sandbags. I mean, it is just horrific. We've recently, there's been the coverage of Russians using soldiers from ethnic minorities and putting landmines on them and sending them out. I mean, it is just barbaric. So when you have such a low level of value placed on human life, and the Ukrainians, not only do they not place such a low value on human life, they also cannot afford to. So hence that creates this innovation around, we've talked a lot about UAVs, but even unmanned ground vehicles has been huge because the loss of life that was happening for medivacs was so high. So the Ukrainians have innovated very well to create robots to get injured compatriots out. And again, that has been very important because another point of innovation that the Russians did was that they created loiter drones, which they would effectively park just in the fields. And then when an armed FPV drone would fly into a vehicle or what have you, then they would wait for Ukrainians to come get them out. And then these loiter drones, they would send them up and take them out with those. So Russia and Ukraine are not playing by the same rules. And none of us in Europe and the West are playing by the same rules as Russia, which is why if we had more decisiveness in our actions, for example, yesterday, this is a slightly tangential topic, but yesterday the reports of the Russian ship that was dropped anchor over our subsea cables, and I know that scrambled is the technical term for any aircraft being sent out, but I was reading earlier this morning, scrambled to me implies a slight sense of urgency to it, but it was sent out 14 hours after the reports. So, we are not responding to these things, which is imperative that we must, because Russia is never going to play by the same rules and values that we do or Ukraine does.
I think that nicely segues into taking a bit of a step back in terms of the wider strategic piece and the threats that Russia, the threats that Russia is arraying against countries outside of Europe. We here at Sibylline follow in great detail the large array of threats that are impacting daily life across the European continent, most of which, as you rightly say, nobody hears about. No one really hears about it and understands the scale. Just, you mentioned as well the Russian production rates, that a lot of them are, the second front that you mentioned. Something that we've been tracking as well is armoured vehicle and tank production. It's been an interesting evolution. That was an extremely important metric for us to try and understand how Russia could sustain the war in Ukraine. That metric has now shifted. The Russians aren't really using these systems in Ukraine, but they are still producing them at a significant rate. And the question is, well, what are they going to be using them for in the future? And that's to the point that you made earlier that, are they preparing for some sort of future contingency against NATO, against other vulnerable states, etc. But obviously, I think broadly speaking, we can agree that at least in the short term, the Russians aren't in a position to start a clear kinetic war with NATO. But what I'm mostly concerned about and what we're tracking very, very closely is this, hybrid war. The grey zone in the West, I know different meaning in Ukraine, but this hybrid war which is waging. And we've seen an increasing number of senior British and European security officers, military officers, openly now talking about something which is apparent to all of us in the space that watch this every day. We've known this for years. It's now starting to enter the national and international consciousness that this is a threat that should be taken seriously. What's your stance? What's your take?
I think it is at the very early stages of permeating the public conscience, and that is not anybody's fault. Ultimately, it is down to media coverage, or lack of. And this has become a huge point of concern for me, and to be honest, was not something I particularly thought about when I was in Ukraine, because things were kinetic. I absolutely was aware of Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But most of all, it was, of course, kinetic. But since coming back to the UK, it is very clear to me that there is a huge risk here that is not being talked about openly with governments, with policymakers, from them talking to populations. And so the lack of awareness. So people hear about, okay, there was some small reconnaissance drones that closed down an airport, and okay, now the subsea cables and Russian tankers piece, that's starting to become better covered. But I don't think that fundamental mindset shift of Russia is attacking the rest of Europe, I don't think that has bled through. And it is a little bit like COVID, in the sense that if you can't see it, if you can't touch it, if you can't see any clear results from it, it's quite hard for it to permeate your consciousness, understandably. So, and the biggest weapon of all is the Russian disinformation piece. And again, from my background in tech, I have an appreciation of how potent those tools can be. And it greatly concerns me because Russia is doing it very effectively, and no one wants to be told, oh, is perhaps the reason that you are feeling more outraged about something, or feeling more disillusionment with your government, or feeling more frustrated around issues of immigration. No one wants to be told your views might have been altered by Russian disinformation. You can't have that conversation with people. But to me, it is very clear that that is what is happening. Russia is very good at what it does. It is not going to be putting open things on the internet of Putin is great. It is subtle. It is division. It is feelings of outrage. Outrage is the single most potent emotion that Russia can use. And all of us are subject to it, including me. I realized even just the other day, I sent a piece of misinformation to someone about a post about one of Trump's people who used a slogan, and people said, oh, it's a Nazi slogan, and isn't this horrific? And I sent it to someone saying, oh, isn't this awful? And then I luckily noticed a comment of someone saying, this isn't true. And I checked it, and it wasn't. So we're all subject to it. I'm no better than anyone else, but it's Russia is very good at distracting people from the core threats to them. So no one is thinking, oh, well, yes, one of the major threats to the quality of life of me, my family, my children is a threat from Russia. No one is thinking that. People are understandably worried about much more immediate problems, such as an economy, or can they afford a home, or any of these more potent things. People are frustrated by day-to-day things such as, how's the council working? Are there potholes in the road? All of these very immediate things. So then you create a situation where as long as people are outraged and distracted by those things, no one is going to be concerned about the threat from Russia and ultimately prepared to pay taxes for it.
Right. And I think that's an extremely important point that you raise, and does feed into the wider coordinated nature of the grey zone war that is being waged across our continent, including here in the UK. And we've actually just launched a new product line, UK and Ireland National Resilience Monitor, which precisely attempts to track the various threats from Russia as the principal threat, but also other state actors, China, Iran, state and non-state actors as well, that could well and is undermining our resilience as a society. And so the distraction, the vague nature, the ambiguous nature of this campaign is precisely its strength. And it does make it hard to communicate, to convey the severity of the threat and translate these seemingly disparate, isolated incidents across the UK, across Germany, Poland, etc., into a broader understanding of what actually this means for everybody's safety at a fundamental level, our security, and how that does impact the ability to keep the NHS, our healthcare running, basic, government operations. I mean, the rate of cyber attacks, for example, is increasing every year. And we can trace a good amount of those back to Russia or pro-Russian or Russian adjacent, or indeed just Russian employed. They may not even know they're doing a Russian operation, but they're just being paid. And a good proportion of that is targeting our health system.
As like I was going to say, there was a report I read last year, which only ran up to the end of 2024. But in that report, 20% of Russia's hybrid attacks on NATO states were on healthcare providers,
right? Which
of course makes sense because it's so much sensitive data. And how many healthcare providers can afford to invest in their cybersecurity enough to protect themselves? And again, this is a huge issue. If you have a very large conglomerate, they can afford to protect themselves. But you go to any company that is a slightly smaller size than that, maybe doesn't have these budgets, maybe doesn't have the awareness of these risks and isn't thinking about these things in this way. And this is where the lack of an open dialogue about these risks is so dangerous, because in terms of cybersecurity, everyone does need to be battening down the hatches. But why would they if they don't even know they need to?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly it. And, in the cyberspace, a lot of attention has been given to that, but not enough, as you say, because the threats are increasing every year. But there's also the kinetic threats, which people just don't think about. They don't think that, sabotage would actually impact them. We're seeing this across Europe. Sabotage is happening at, the numbers of attacks that we've been tracking. 2022 was a significant, doubling from the previous year. Then again, 2023, 2024. The trend is pretty clear. And, this is part of the wider coordinated campaign, which is clearly to try and impact decision makers, to incur costs that supporting Ukraine or just obstructing Russian interests will incur costs. And like you say, sow division. I think Moscow very much sees this all as a zero-sum game.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that I try to pass on to people is that Russia is not going to attack other European countries by firing in missiles or sending in tanks or sending in planes. People need to stop thinking about war as conventional warfare. The way they're going to attack us is by attacking our civilian populations. And that is our communications, our power, subsea cables, our water. Russia is doing that. They've broken into water treatment plants already. Our soft underbelly, because if you create a crisis, then the country has to look inwards and it cannot look outwards. And probably other key European allies are focused then on them. The reason we are vulnerable is because, like every country in the world, there is a civilian population that needs to be protected. And this is where it is so important to grasp Russian psychology, because they are not in any way opposed to weaponizing the vulnerabilities of a civilian population. And that is what we have seen in Ukraine time again. I have lived through it. I've lived through those freezing evenings where you don't have heating, you don't have light, you can't cook food, you can't have a hot shower. And these are minor problems in comparison. But when it is extended, the way that we are seeing what is happening during this winter in Ukraine right now and what it is doing to that civilian population, and Russia weaponizes the vulnerability of a civilian population. And that is how Russia is attacking us and will continue to. So one of the issues in the West is our division between our armed forces and our civil society, and seeing, oh, well, this is the armed forces' job to protect us from this. But that entire civilian infrastructure needs to be protected. And ultimately, that will be by the people who work in that sphere, first and foremost. And also why it is such a point of concern that Russia is now recruiting civilians from that person's country. So we have seen this already, Russia recruiting people across multiple countries. But yes, examples I've noticed most have been within the UK. These are British people being hired online or through social media by the Russians. Some of them know they're being hired by the Russians, some of them don't. And just being paid to do things. So any individual civilian is a potential Russian, not even just asset, but acting agent. This is huge points of vulnerability. And and because these are individual people, not parts of organizations, and it's one-on-one contact with their Russian handlers, it's very hard for our security services to track these things and to protect the country from them.
It's very subtle and very ambiguous in many instances. As you say, people don't know they're being recruited by the GRU, the Russian intelligence service, but subsequent investigations clearly show this has got the GRU's hands all over it. But
some of them have. The ones who did the sabotage fire on the warehouse and burnt around £1 million worth of kit going to Ukraine, they were recruited by Wagner, and the main person knew. He then sub-hired people who did not know, who actually set the fire themselves. But the original person absolutely knew where it was coming from.
Absolutely. And I think, these threats are only going to proliferate in our assessment throughout 2026, particularly given the importance of ongoing negotiations over Ukraine. Obviously, the US's position on this is absolutely vital. But to a significant degree, European decision makers will play an important role in potentially blocking a deal which the Russians would deem to be preferable to themselves. What are your thoughts on the negotiations at the present time? Obviously, lots of frenetic diplomatic activity over the last few months, although fallen slightly from the news in the early 2026, given just how much has been going on around the world. And I think that does speak to a wider fatigue around the war, but also distraction.
Exactly. And I'm afraid I actually slightly disagree with what you said, in that I think the quicker we'll treat the American position as not mattering, the better off everyone will be. The amount of distraction around what was the last thing that Trump said is completely distracting from the core elements. When I was last in Ukraine, I did actually ask quite a few Ukrainian people who I know, oh, what do you think about Trump? And for them, understandably, it's essentially irrelevant, because it changes nothing for them, whether Trump has said this or gone back on that or what have you. The times where there have been clear effects was when, for instance, he cut off access to military intelligence, and that was a huge contributing factor to Russia retaking Kursk. But if we think of all of the noise and all of the drama and all of the hyperbole that's been coming out of the States, that's been that one time that there's been a really discernible impact for the Ukrainians. I think the key thing with the States, at the risk of putting it slightly simplistically, is thinking, what are the key points of leverage that they currently have on Ukraine? So at the moment, they are not sending military aid. That's stopped. So it's the things that Europe is acquiring on Ukraine's behalf, key thing being air defense. You cannot get Patriot missile systems from elsewhere. So a point where Ukraine and also Europe can develop and have those sovereign capabilities for themselves is key. And the other point, as I mentioned, is intelligence. Those have been the key points where America has turned the taps on and off. And if those levers are removed, then it would be much more possible to screen out the noise, because ultimately Trump is more aligned with Russia than with Ukraine. That much has been made very clear. So we cannot take it for granted that America's position on this can be held and may hold in any trajectory that is not against Ukraine. So covering for all potential scenarios, be able to remove those points of leverage is the best way for Europe and Ukraine to protect itself.
I suppose, yeah, I see your point. I suppose the problem is it's the timescales involved in building these capabilities. Like you say, Patriots, no one else produces them. The decisions that, if the decisions in 2022 had been made to massively increase European defence expenditure, we may well be in that position now. But they haven't even now been made. And of course, the situation in Ukraine is becoming ever more acute for Ukrainian forces, that there's a limit in terms of what Europeans can offer Ukraine over a longer term. There are some success stories, though, and there's been some reporting, for example, in the Financial Times just this last week at time of recording, that Rheinmetall, the German defense company, is set to, at some point, be able to produce 1.5 million shells, 155 millimeter shells, which is the bread and butter of much of Ukrainian fires operations, which is pretty much the same as the entire US military industrial base can produce in terms of 155 millimeter. So the Europeans are stepping up in various ways, but of course it's a pretty uneven picture. And there are some systems where the Americans do retain a near monopoly in terms of the production of this. Those are vital systems to Ukrainians. So I think I understand what your points. I think the Americans will inevitably play an important role in at least facilitating any security guarantees indirectly, perhaps with Patriot systems, etc., at the very minimum. But Europe, it's seemingly willing to begin discussing the possibility of a peace, and the French and the British have stated that they are ready to deploy troops, but there are serious questions about the viability of that, even if we are willing to do it.
It's great, of course, that those statements have been made, but ultimately there is no indication that Russia has any intention of stopping its offensive action. Right. In which case, any of these conversations around, well, what will a ceasefire look like? Yes, it is good and important to have those conversations, but at the moment, there is absolutely zero signal from Russia that it would be prepared to agree to any current form of peace plan. The entire engagement so far has been something of a farce, because everybody knows there is no way that Putin can agree to a ceasefire at all, let alone one that does not include total control of the Donbass.
I think that's the key issue. The Russians wouldn't be willing, at least very much our assessment, that the Russians are unwilling. It's not really in their interests, if you look at it from their strategic perspective, to cease fire currently without significant territorial concessions from the Ukrainians to be able to sell to the Russian people that this was a victory. And I suppose the question around, this is where the security guarantees are so vital. At what point does, even if the Ukrainians cede the Donbass, which are amongst the most heavily defended areas in the entire country, where they've invested significant amounts of resources in this fortress belt of cities, for example, though if they ceded those territories, what's to stop the Russians from just starting again in a year's time, when they've had time to lick their wounds, rebuild capability, and then they're moving on to Dnipro?
Absolutely. But people absolutely point out the importance of this fortress belt. I think that is a very foreign-centric view. Because although it is absolutely strategically true, no one in Ukraine would be willing to give up those key cities because they are Ukrainian cities, and ultimately it is about people.
Right.
Trump is very good at creating a narrative that becomes about territory, real estate. It is ultimately dehumanizing at base. If anyone thinks about any city or town in their own country that they know, let's take a British city. Let's take Bristol. Bad luck for Bristol. You're all under Russian occupation now. No one here would be willing.
It's very easy to understand the strategic importance of various places, but they do have a human element to it, absolutely. And I think that's the thing. In polling, for example, we're seeing not much readiness to cede these territories. And indeed, President Zelensky has stated a potential willingness to cede territory. But if that was to be the case, it would have to go to a referendum, for example. And there's
very smart, because
right.
he knows. So I've never ever met a single Ukrainian person ever who says we should cede the Donbass to Putin, because they know that Russia, as you said, would use it as a springboard to create future attacks, but also that is sentencing so many people to Russian occupation, the persecution, the indoctrination, children being stolen, people being tortured, use of sexual violence. This is a horrific thing. So we talk about, let's just cede some territory. Again, it is missing the point of what people under Russian occupation experience. Children being told in schools to inform on their own parents if they have a Ukrainian flag. Children who draw drawings with some kind of pro-Ukraine stance being punished. This is real. And no Ukrainian person, no matter how exhausted they are, no matter how much personal loss they have suffered, no matter if they have lost very close loved ones fighting at the front, if they themselves have lived under occupation, if they themselves have lost everything, it doesn't matter what the makeup of these people are in terms of the hardship they have experienced. Not one of them says, actually, I think we should give up the Donbass and have peace, because they know that it is completely a false premise for peace, but also what it would mean for those people. Having said that, it is important not to take Ukrainian resilience for granted. Ukrainian resilience is often referred to, and it is something that deserves a huge amount of admiration and respect, but that does not mean that it is infinite either. And that breaking point could happen at the moment. The hardship that's happening with a very cold winter, also hardships in summers. The last 2 years I was there living in the south, it was 40 degrees in the shade. It's an agricultural heavy part of the country. It is, of course, an entirely very agricultural country. But so you've got the farmers who were risking getting blown up by trying to drill their fields. I remember speaking to a farmer who was in tears, just from exhaustion and fear that today might be the day that he hit a mine. Then you've got the crops. They can't afford the pesticides, so they're literally trying to hoe them physically by hand, and then they themselves could tread on a mine. The Russians destroyed the water system, so all of the irrigation water systems are gone. So they hardly have any water. So then the crops are failing. And then, of course, you have wide outbreak of wildfires. And you have Russians deliberately setting fires with FPV drones. And then when the firemen come out to try and put the fires out, then you have Russian FPV drones hunting them. And that's
exhausting. Absolutely exhausting. And I suppose that's part of the rationale behind Russia's long-range strike campaign. This is trying to undermine morale close to the front line, and also in the rear, in the major cities as well. Yes. People having to deal with this horrific winter.
Yes.
That's part of the rationale.
Yes. Which, of course, doesn't work. And there have been many studies of this that actually...
Military history has shown that
it increases resolve and unity.
It often has the adverse effect, but that doesn't necessarily... And again, military history has also shown us that has not really had much of an impact on decision makers' belief in long-range strikes, etc., to undermine morale. But I think your point about Ukrainian resilience not, can't be we can't take it for granted, I think, is a key one. All wars end. Sometimes they may end with a very neat peace treaty. Others end much more messily. I feel it's likely to be one of the latter than the former. And in terms of the time frame, it's a bit unclear as to when that breaking point for Ukraine is. And you're absolutely right to highlight the human and emotional involvement here in terms of the Ukrainian people's willingness to accept concessions, etc. That is often lost in the West when we're removed from it. We're looking from a strategic perspective. But Zelensky in Kyiv has to consider those strategic questions as well, which we've been mentioning about the potential for the breaking point, the potential for when does this end, what does it look like? And I suppose at that point, there could well be that disconnect between the decision makers that are being forced to confront the possibility of, if we don't agree now, what will happen in the future, etc., and all those uncertainties versus the population, which is increasingly exhausted, but doesn't really see a positive way out.
I actually think there is great cohesion between the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian people on that front, and why Zelensky has been so not only right but also smart to say that territory would only be ceded with the national referendum. This is so far from an autocracy, and I don't think that there is a division there. Of course, more pressure is put on the leadership individually, and a huge amount of pressure has been put on Zelensky individually in that awful debacle in the Oval Office where Zelensky was so impressive in the face of the behaviour he was being subjected to. And the Ukrainian people really rallied behind him on that. That was huge for national unity and cohesion and all of these things, despite Russia's propaganda attempts constantly attempting to fracture and create division and resentment against Zelensky. There's a huge amount of Russian propaganda that pours into that. Although having said that, my take on it is that one of the largest rhetorics that Russia pushes is that Ukraine is alone. And other countries do not support Ukraine anymore. People have given up. And ultimately, it's hopeless. Don't bother fighting. Certainly don't go to the conscription office and sign up to fight. It's hopeless. Just batten down the hatches, try and look after your kids, keep your head down. That's the narrative that really seems to be pushed. And it's so damaging. And it's that, again, harking back to what we're talking about with the subtleties of Russian disinformation and propaganda attempts, these are the sorts of things that can be so damaging to that point of Ukrainian resilience if it does feel as if the rest of Europe has just given up. But as things maybe move in a direction that is more unified in Europe, potentially with the situation with Greenland, there are the increased, more visible Russian threats, potentially that will be there.
Absolutely. And your point about, Ukraine is alone, that's the narrative that's being pushed. Of course, Ukraine hasn't been alone by many definitions. Yourself, other volunteers going out to Ukraine, Western support, etc. Just maybe to wrap up what's been a fascinating conversation, what was it like being a foreigner in Ukraine during that time? You went to Ukraine with no affiliation, although there, of course, a broad outpouring of support for Ukraine across the West at the time. But when you're in country, what was that like?
I learned what I did not expect, which was how Russia viewed us. What is quite gratifying, although also is potentially a risk for us, is that actually in the West, day-to-day people, nobody cares about Russia. Nobody thinks about Russia. Nobody is interested. Now it's a bit of an issue that people maybe don't see it as a threat that they may be new to, and they maybe need to be a little bit more cognizant of Russia and its attitudes towards us. But it's actually quite amusing how unbalanced the attention is on Europe, on the West, but I would say specifically on the UK.
Yes.
And they really, the vitriol that they feel towards the UK and how far back it goes. I actually had this conversation with a Russian that I was not expecting to meet this person only last week. And they started to come out with the traditional narrative of, oh, well, the war is NATO's fault because NATO expanded and all of that trope. And I mentioned, oh, well, it's a defensive alliance. We have not invaded Russia. And he got very emotional and angry and said, what about 1842? Which was a proxy war in Afghanistan. And Britain certainly did not invade Russia. But that's just one example of this mindset. But in terms of being in country, we were absolutely aware that we were potentially at risk. And one of the visible ways of this was that the Russians ran a channel on Telegram called Track a Nazi Merc, which is short for Track a Nazi Mercenary, where they would just pull photographs of foreigners, be them foreign fighters or foreign volunteers, whatever. They would pull photographs from their social media or wherever they could find them, and they would write a short paragraph or two profile on this person, some of which would be seeded in truth of what they were doing in Ukraine, but then they would also twist it. It was a perfect example of that sort of narcissistic state rhetoric. So they would say, oh, Bob, is here, and actually this person would be a volunteer, but they would say, Bob is a mercenary and, fighting and killing Russians, and he's a very sorry character because his girlfriend left him. It was as if some sort of teenager had written it. It was bizarrely immature. It was quite entertaining to read, if also quite dark. So the way that they approach us is very crude, very immature, but very, very prevalent. And it is worth watching Russia Today with English subtitles if you can access it. There's a YouTube channel called Russian Media Monitor that publishes the odd video, and the amount that they talk about the UK, and I was thinking about this the other day. They really care far more than we do that we are a post-empirical state. They talk about the UK as this dying old man and former glory, and I don't think anyone in the UK is harking back to the days of being an empire. It's just not something that's in the national consciousness. But they care about it more than we do. So they will talk about all these rhetorics, and it is ultimately because Russia has empirical aspirations and to expand and to control other nation states and to not respect their sovereignty and all of these things. So the fact that the UK is seen by Russia as the ideological leader of Western values of democracy, free speech, free press, all of these things that we thankfully take completely for granted, that is a threat to them. We are not a threat because we support Ukraine. That is a byproduct, not the cause. They hate what our society stands for. And this is why, harking back to what we were saying earlier about Russian disinformation, it's understandably difficult for normal people to think, to not take those things for granted and to think, you know what, maybe I'm going to be less focused on some of these more toxic issues and think, well, yes, there are some things here that aren't great, but ultimately we live in a free society and we have these free principles protected. It's very important to keep our eye on the bigger picture in that sense. So for me, being a foreigner in Ukraine, I purely learned how much they hate us. And if we think what Russia has been prepared to do to Ukraine, what would they be willing to do to us?
I think it's a sober thought to end on, really, and very much underscores our own, analysis that the UK is extremely important in the state rhetoric, shall we say, and it is a clear and permanent, feature in Russian entertaining, but also quite alarming in some instances, on state media and such. And I think that does, feed back into the importance of resilience in this country, that Russia is that threat which we're identifying, but there's a bit of a disconnect between what is there. If you're a Russia watcher, you read this, you see it every day in the state media, and you track the threats to this country as well. So very sober thoughts to end. But Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been fascinating to get your insights and you know, to hear from your experiences being in Ukraine for 3 years and what you learned. But what are you up to at the moment? What's next for you?
Since coming back from Ukraine, I have essentially become conscious that there are not many Westerners who've spent that amount of time in those areas in country, and also can talk about it openly. So my focus now is sharing these learnings where it is of use for British, European, NATO readiness to face the threats that are coming. So be that for our armed forces, for the defence industry, and indeed other industries that are maybe looking at potential reconstruction, energy, investment into defence technology and innovation. All of these areas that are coming together to help our defence as a continent.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening to this podcast. If you liked it, please do give us a like, comment, and share all of our content. If you're interested in more geopolitical analysis, please do check out our other media streams. And until next time, see you later.